The bride never looked at the groom. She was staring at the church doors as if she knew someone was coming. The church bells were still ringing when the front doors slammed against the walls. Dust swirled across the aisle. A cattle baron strode inside, his boots pounding against the wooden floor, while a folded bundle of papers hung from one hand. The groom's smile vanished. The bride gripped her bouquet so tightly, a few white petals drifted to the floor. Then the stranger shouted 4 words that stopped the entire ceremony, and nobody in the church could look away. What do you think he was about to reveal? Tell me below. The spring cattle season always arrived before the dust settled in Silver Mesa. By sunrise, wagons already crowded the main street. Horses stood tied outside the general store. Men in trail coats filled the boardwalks, talking about beef prices, water rights, and how many head would move north before summer. Inside the Silver Lantern boarding house, Delilah Turner was already working. A pot of coffee simmered on the stove. Biscuit trays cooled beside the window. A ledger lay open near her elbow, every number written in neat, careful rows. Most people never noticed the handwriting. They noticed the coffee when it was late. They noticed the food when it was cold. They noticed Delilah only when something needed doing. "Table 3 needs more cups," Ruth Turner called from across the room. Delilah nodded and carried the tray over without a word. Ruth was dressed better than usual that morning. A new hat, fresh gloves. She moved through the boarding house greeting guests as though the place belonged entirely to her. By noon, everyone in Silver Mesa seemed to know the news. Gideon Price was marrying Delilah Turner. People congratulated Ruth. People congratulated Gideon. No one congratulated Delilah. She carried plates past smiling faces and listened to strangers discuss her future as if she were livestock already sold. Outside, church bells rang once across town. Inside, laughter filled the room. Delilah kept moving. That evening, ranch owners gathered for a supper celebrating the coming cattle season. Oil lamps glowed above long wooden tables. The smell of roasted beef mixed with cigar smoke. At the center of the room sat Gideon Price, polished and confident. Every conversation seemed to drift toward him. Delilah stayed near the walls. That was where she always belonged, or so people assumed. A tray balanced on her hands as she crossed the room. Someone bumped a chair. One glass slid toward the edge. The room never noticed. A hand appeared before the glass could fall. Strong fingers caught it. Steady. Certain. Delilah looked up. The man holding the glass was taller than most in the room. Dust still clung to his boots. Sun and wind had left their marks across his face. Cole Bennett, owner of Bennett Ridge, one of the largest cattle ranches in the territory. He set the glass back onto the tray. "Would have been a shame to lose good coffee," he said. The corner of Delilah's mouth almost moved. Almost. "Thank you," she replied. Their eyes met for a moment. Not long, just long enough for both to remember it. Then the room pulled them apart again. The evening continued. Speeches, laughter, business, promises. When the last guest finally left, the boarding house grew quiet. Delilah carried empty dishes toward the kitchen. As she passed the office doorway, voices stopped her. Ruth and Gideon. The door stood slightly open. "After the wedding," Ruth said, "she'll sign everything." Gideon gave a short laugh. "She won't even know what she's signing." Delilah froze. The floorboards creaked beneath her boots. Inside the room, papers rustled. "Once it's done," Ruth continued, "there won't be any more problems." Delilah stared at the narrow strip of light beneath the door. Sign what? What problems? No answer came. Only silence. Then another page turning. Slowly, she stepped back into the dark hallway. Outside, wind moved across the empty street. For the first time since hearing about the wedding, something felt wrong. Not strange, not uncomfortable. Wrong. And somewhere beyond town, Under the fading Arizona sky, a cattle baron rode home across the red mesas, carrying the memory of a woman who stood alone in a room full of light. Cole Bennett did not come back to the Silver Lantern the next morning. He waited 2 days. That was how he did most things. He gave a matter room to prove whether it was sense or foolishness. By the third morning, with dust lying pale on the road and the butcher sweeping flies from his doorway, Cole tied his bay horse outside the boarding house and stepped inside. Delilah was behind the counter with the ledger open. A pencil rested behind her ear. A coffee stain marked the cuff of her plain brown dress. She was adding a column of figures while Ruth spoke loudly near the stairway about wedding lace and proper gloves. Cole removed his hat. "Morning." Delilah looked up. "Just once. Coffee? If there's some left." "There is." She poured it into a white cup with a chip along the rim. He noticed she turned the chipped side toward herself when she set it down, as if saving him from the flaw. He paid with a nickel. She wrote it in the ledger. "Boarding house keeps close accounts," Cole said. "Somebody has to." Ruth's voice sharpened from across the room. "Delilah, when you're finished playing clerk, Mrs. Hanley needs towels." Delilah closed the ledger without changing her face. Cole looked at Ruth, then back at Delilah. "I can wait." "It's only towels," she said. But her hand stayed on the ledger a second too long before she walked away. After that, Cole found reasons to come back. One day he asked about freight charges for flour brought in from Tucson Road. Another day he bought coffee and left before it cooled. Once he brought a broken bridle strap and asked whether anyone in town could stitch leather better than the smith. Delilah gave him a name, a street, and a fair price. Never more than he asked, never less than he needed. Gideon Price came often, too. When he entered, men straightened. Ruth smiled before he spoke. Delilah did neither. Gideon brought folded papers, catalogs from Prescott, and a small velvet box he never opened in front of her. He chose the wedding date while Delilah stood beside the stove holding a towel. He chose the church flowers. He chose the room where she would live after the wedding, above the bank, with windows facing the courthouse. "You won't have to concern yourself with kitchen work much longer," Gideon said one afternoon. Delilah wiped a spot from a saucer. "Work has never bothered me." His smile stayed in place. "A wife of mine will learn different habits." Cole heard it from the doorway. He said nothing, but his hand tightened around the brim of his hat. That same evening, Cole rode to the county records office before closing. The clerk, Mr. Phelps, was sweeping sand from the floor and muttering about men who came in late. Cole laid 2 receipts on the desk. "Need to check an old parcel near Cedar Creek." Phelps sighed, unlocked the cabinet, and pulled the dusty books down one by one. The room smelled of paper, lamp oil, and old rain in the walls. Cole turned pages until the light thinned. Then he saw the name. Turner. Not Ruth. Not Gideon. Delilah Turner. A deed transfer had been marked incomplete 12 years earlier. Land near the planned railroad cut. Water rights attached. A family claim no one had closed. Cole read it twice, then a third time. In the margin, another name appeared in darker ink. Ezekiel Price. Cole stood still for a long moment. Outside, the wind scraped dust against the window. At the Silver Lantern, Delilah was folding clean towels by lamplight when Gideon entered the back hall. Ruth followed him, whispering. Cole watched from the street through the yellow window glow. Gideon took Delilah's hand as if it had already been promised beyond recall. Delilah did not pull away, but she did not lean toward him either. Cole folded the copy of the deed into his coat. For the first time in many years, he found himself caring about something that had no place on his own land, and that made it dangerous. The trip south began before dawn. The sky over Silver Mesa was still dark when wagons rolled onto the trail. Lanterns swayed from hooks. Horses stamped in the cool morning air. The smell of leather, Dust and coffee drifted through camp as men checked harnesses one last time. Gideon Price rode near the front. Delilah had hoped she would not be asked to join the survey party. She was wrong. Ruth had packed her bag herself. A future wife ought to know her future property, she had said. The words stayed with Delilah during the entire ride. Future property. She could not decide whether Ruth meant the land or herself. The road wound south through dry washes and red stone ridges. Mesquite bushes clung stubbornly to the earth. Buzzards circled high above the empty country. Cole rode with the escort hands. Most of the day he stayed where he belonged. Not beside Delilah. Not close enough for gossip. Just near enough to notice. When her canteen strap loosened, he handed her a spare leather tie. When her horse stumbled crossing a rocky creek bed, he steadied the animal before it could panic. Neither mentioned it. By afternoon, the sun became brutal. Heat shimmered above the ground. The survey wagons slowed. One wheel sank into soft sand beside a dry arroyo. Several men climbed down to push. Gideon remained mounted. "It's not moving," one of the drivers called. Gideon glanced toward the wagon and then toward the shade of a cottonwood. "Figure it out." He rode away from the work. The men exchanged looks but said nothing. Cole dismounted without a word. Delilah watched him shoulder against the wagon beside the others until the wheel finally broke free. Sweat darkened his shirt. Dust covered his boots. When he finished, he returned to his horse as though it had never been worth mentioning. The contrast settled somewhere deep inside her. That night, camp was made near a low ridge. Canvas tents rose against the fading sky. Coffee boiled over a fire ring. The cattle hands played cards beside a wagon lantern. Delilah sat alone on an overturned crate holding a tin cup. The desert looked different after sunset. Softer, lonelier. Across the fire, Gideon and his brother Ezekiel stood beside the survey maps. They thought no one could hear. The wind carried their voices anyway. "Once she signs," Ezekiel said, tapping a folded document, "the transfer becomes permanent. And if she asks questions, she won't know what she's looking at." A pause. Then Gideon laughed quietly. "The wedding solves everything." Delilah froze. The cup in her hands suddenly felt heavier. The fire crackled. Someone laughed near the wagons. The world continued exactly as before. Yet nothing was the same. For several moments she could not move. The missing pieces finally slid together. The papers. The wedding. Ruth's conversation. Everything. She was not being married. She was being used. Long after camp settled into silence, Delilah remained awake. Moonlight silvered the desert. The wind moved across the rocks. She stood, pulled on her coat, and walked away from camp. No destination, just distance. Far enough that she could breathe. She climbed a low rise overlooking the valley. A weathered stone outcrop sat there like an island in the darkness. Delilah lowered herself onto the rock. Below her, camp lanterns glowed faintly. Tiny. Far away. For the first time in years, tears threatened. Not because of Gideon, not because of the land, because suddenly she understood that every decision had already been made for her long before she knew it existed. Footsteps approached through the gravel. Slow, unhurried. She didn't need to turn around. Cole Bennett sat down on another rock a few feet away. He kept the distance between them, the same careful distance he always kept. Neither spoke at first. The wind carried sand across the stone. Coyotes called somewhere beyond the ridge. "I wasn't trying to follow you," Cole finally said. Delilah almost smiled. "Then you're very bad at not following people." That earned the smallest laugh from him. The sound disappeared as quickly as it came. Silence returned. Gentler this time. After a while, Delilah looked out across the moonlit desert. "I think my whole life," she said quietly, "I've been something people traded. Cole said nothing. She appreciated that. No speeches, no false comfort, just listening. My parents died. The words came slowly. Then Ruth decided where I'd live, what I'd do, who I'd become. She swallowed. And now Gideon decides what I'll sign. The desert wind tugged at her hair. I don't think anyone ever asked what I wanted. Cole stared toward the horizon. Then he removed his coat. Without a word, he placed it over her shoulders. The fabric still carried warmth, still carried dust from the trail. Delilah looked down at it, then at him. Cole didn't try to explain, didn't move closer, didn't ask for anything. For some reason, that made the gesture mean more. Below them, camp lanterns flickered in the darkness. Ahead of them, the desert stretched toward places neither could yet see. And somewhere between the silence, the wind, and the borrowed coat resting around her shoulders, something began to change. Not quickly, not loudly, but enough that neither of them would ever be able to return completely to who they had been before this night. The ride back to Silver Mesa took 2 days. No one mentioned what had happened on the ridge. Delilah returned Cole's coat before they reached town. He accepted it without argument. Yet when their fingers briefly touched, both hesitated for a moment longer than necessary. Then the moment passed. Silver Mesa was waiting. So was the wedding. The following week moved like a wagon rolling downhill with no one holding the reins. Dress fittings, church meetings, guest lists, flower orders arriving from Tucson. Every morning brought another detail that had already been decided. Ruth seemed happier than Delilah had ever seen her. Gideon seemed calmer. That frightened Delilah more. Twice she tried to speak. Twice she stopped. Because every conversation ended the same way. It's already arranged. Those 3 words followed her everywhere. One afternoon she stood alone in the church. The white wooden building sat near the center of town. Sunlight spilled through the stained glass windows and stretched across the pews. The place should have felt peaceful. Instead, it felt like a room closing around her. The wedding was 4 days away. She sat quietly near the back. Outside, wagon wheels rattled over the road. Somewhere nearby, a blacksmith's hammer rang against steel. Life continued, as if nothing were wrong. That evening, Cole Bennett rode to Prescott. The county attorney met him after dark. The meeting lasted hours. Documents changed hands. Old records emerged from forgotten boxes. Witness statements were gathered. By midnight, Cole knew 2 things. The land had belonged to Delilah's family, and Gideon Price knew it. The original records had been altered years earlier. Signatures moved, pages replaced, dates rewritten. Every trail led back to Ezekiel Price. The wedding day arrived beneath a cloudless Arizona sky. Church bells rang across Silver Mesa. People filled the streets before noon. Women adjusted hats. Men gathered beneath the shade of storefront awnings. Everyone wanted to see the banker marry the boarding house girl. Inside the church, Ruth sat proudly in the front pew. Sheriff Wade Collins stood near the side aisle. Gideon waited at the altar wearing a dark suit brought in from Phoenix. He looked completely certain of the future. Delilah entered on Ruth's arm. The church rose. For a brief moment she saw every face. Then the room blurred. The only thing she heard clearly was the sound of her own footsteps on the wooden floor. One step, then another, then another. The ceremony began. The minister opened his Bible. Guests settled into silence. Outside, wind rattled the cottonwoods. Dearly beloved. The church doors exploded open. Every head turned. Dust blew through the entrance. A man stood there breathing hard from the ride. Cole Bennett. His coat was covered in road dust. Behind him came the county attorney, 2 elderly ranchers, and a deputy carrying a leather document case. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Cole walked down the aisle. His boots echoed across the church floor. Gideon's smile vanished. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. Cole never looked away from him. "The meaning," he said quietly, "is that this wedding stops now." Gasps spread through the pews. Ruth rose to her feet. The minister lowered his Bible. Sheriff Wade stepped forward. Cole pointed directly at Gideon. Then he looked at Delilah. His voice carried through the entire church. "She's mine." The room froze. Delilah stared at him. So did everyone else. But there was no ownership in his voice. No claim. No demand. Only certainty. The certainty of a man refusing to let another human being be sacrificed for greed. Gideon's face darkened. "You've lost your mind." "No," Cole replied. Then he nodded toward the attorney. The leather case opened. Documents appeared. Original deeds. Property records. Witness statements. The attorney began reading, one page after another. Silence spread through the church. The names matched. The signatures matched. The dates matched. And every document pointed to the same truth. The land belonged to Delilah Turner. It always had. Sheriff Wade took the papers and examined them himself. His expression changed. Slowly. Then completely. When he finally looked up, he no longer looked at Gideon as a respected banker. He looked at him as a suspect. The sheriff's voice sounded heavier than usual. "These records appear authentic." Gideon's confidence cracked for the first time. Ruth sank back into her seat. Delilah stood motionless. The entire future she had been pushed toward was collapsing around her, and somehow the only thing she could focus on was the man standing in the aisle. Dust on his boots, hat in his hand, willing to stand against an entire town if necessary. The church bells outside continued ringing, but nothing in Silver Mesa would ever be the same again. The crowd left the church in clusters. Some whispered, some argued. Some simply stood in the street staring at the white building as if it might explain what they had just witnessed. Inside, the silence lingered. Gideon Price had been escorted away with the county attorney and Sheriff Wade Collins carrying the documents that had shattered his plans. Ruth remained seated in the front pew long after everyone else had gone. For the first time in years, she looked smaller, older. Delilah stood near the doorway, sunlight falling across the floorboards between them. "Delilah," Ruth said quietly. The word sounded strange coming from her, not because it was loud, because she finally used her name. Ruth clasped her hands together. "I did what I thought was best." Delilah listened. The old version of herself would have argued, would have tried to explain the hurt. Now she simply waited. "When your parents died, I didn't know how to keep everything together." Her voice trembled. "Then don't explain it," Delilah said gently. Ruth lowered her eyes. A long silence followed. Then Delilah picked up the small travel bag she had brought for the wedding. The same bag, the same belongings, a different future. She walked out of the church without anger, without revenge, without looking back. Cole was waiting beside the hitching rail, not close enough to pressure her, not far enough to disappear. The afternoon wind moved across the street. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Cole held out a folded packet of papers. "The land records are yours." Delilah looked down at them, then back at him. "What happens now?" Cole smiled faintly. "That depends on what you want." Nobody had asked her that before. Months passed. Spring became summer. Summer drifted toward autumn. The land near Cedar Creek was rough and neglected when Delilah first saw it. Sagebrush crowded the fence lines. The barn leaned slightly to one side. The well needed repairs. But it was hers. Every board, every acre, every decision. Cole helped because work needed doing. Nothing more. At least that was what he told himself. Together they repaired broken fences. Together they counted calves during a difficult drought. Together they sat on the porch after long days while the sky turned orange behind the distant mesas. The ranch grew slowly. So did something else. One evening after the first winter snow melted, Cole arrived carrying a wooden box. Inside were official ownership papers, signed, recorded, complete. He placed them on the porch table between them. Delilah stared at the documents, then at him. "What's this?" "The ranch." She blinked. "What do you mean?" Cole looked toward Cedar Creek flowing quietly through the cottonwoods. "It's yours." Delilah laughed softly, thinking he was joking. He wasn't. "You helped build this." "I know. You paid for half of it." "I know." She stared at him. Why? Cole rested his hands on the porch railing. The answer seemed simple to him. Because it was. "If one day you decide to leave," he said quietly, "nobody should be able to stop you." The evening wind moved through the trees. Neither spoke for several seconds. Then Delilah understood. Not the papers, not the land. Him. For the first time in her life, someone cared about her without trying to own her. The following spring, church bells rang again across Silver Mesa. People gathered once more inside the little white church. This time, Delilah walked through the front doors by choice. No pressure, no bargains, no hidden documents waiting on a desk. Only sunlight through stained glass, and Cole Bennett standing at the altar. When their eyes met, the years behind them seemed very far away. The boarding house, the desert ridge, the interrupted wedding, the long days at Cedar Creek. Everything had led here. Outside, the Arizona wind crossed the open grasslands and carried the smell of earth, horses, and new grass. Inside, Delilah smiled. Not because someone had chosen her, because she had finally been free enough to choose for herself. And when the bells rang above Silver Mesa that afternoon, they no longer sounded like an ending. They sounded like home. Maybe that's why this story stays with us. Not because of the land Delilah regained, not because Gideon was exposed, and not even because a wedding was stopped at the last possible moment. It stays with us because, at some point in life, many of us have known what it feels like to stand where Delilah once stood, quietly carrying burdens nobody seemed to notice, living inside decisions made by other people, wondering whether there was truly a place where we belonged. Imagine standing in her shoes. Imagine hearing your own future discussed by everyone except you. Imagine believing that your worth depended on what someone else wanted from you. Then imagine meeting one person who sees you clearly, not as a possession, not as a responsibility, but as a human being worthy of respect. That is what made all the difference. Sometimes love is not the person who holds on the tightest. Sometimes love is the person who opens the gate and says, "You are free to choose." And maybe that is the lesson hidden beneath the dust roads, church bells, and wide Arizona skies. Healing begins when we stop measuring our value through the eyes of people who never truly saw us. Real belonging grows where dignity, trust, and kindness are given room to stay. If this story reminded you of a season in your own life, or of someone who stood beside you when they didn't have to, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if these quiet Western stories of courage, love, and second chances feel like a place you'd like to visit again, I hope you'll join us for the next journey. There are still many roads ahead, many untold stories waiting beyond the horizon, and I'd be honored to share them with you.